Sanctions are often described as pressure, yet pressure alone does not explain endurance. For decades, Iran has operated inside an economic environment designed to restrict access, distort prices, and isolate capital flows. What emerges is not immediate collapse, but a slower transformation where markets bend, institutions harden, and informal systems replace formal channels. Inflation becomes structural, currency instability becomes routine, and survival becomes policy. This is not a story about punishment succeeding or failing. It is a study of how prolonged financial exclusion reshapes an economy, and how that reshaping exposes deeper fractures within the global system itself, today worldwide. Economic sanctions function not as isolated punishments, but as systemic barriers that reroute incentives, capital, and behavior across entire national economies. In the case of Iran, decades of restrictions imposed by the United States gradually inverted normal economic priorities rather than simply compressing output. Access to foreign currency, payment settlement, insurance, shipping, and credit became strategic assets, not neutral utilities supporting commerce. This inversion shifted state focus away from productivity toward control, resilience, and political survivability. When formal financial channels narrow, time and at 0.3s, informal substitutes expanded, creating parallel pricing systems and opaque capital flows. Exchange rates ceased to represent market equilibrium and instead reflected administrative scarcity and expectation management. Inflation was no longer cyclical, but embedded, transmitting pressure continuously through wages, savings, and consumption. Under these conditions, economic performance could not be evaluated by growth metrics alone. Stability became a question of political endurance rather than efficiency. The sanctions regime thus redefined rational behavior for households, firms, and state institutions simultaneously. Capital preservation overtook expansion, liquidity overtook innovation, and access overtook competitiveness. This transformation did not indicate adaptation strength alone. It signaled structural distortion, accumulating quietly over time. By redefining success as survival, the system normalized inefficiencies that would otherwise be unsustainable. What appeared externally as resistance was internally an economy operating permanently under exception rules. Over time, these rules hardened into structure, embedding fragility beneath apparent continuity. This is the central inversion. Sanctions meant to constrain output instead re-engineered the economic logic governing decision-making. The system learned to endure restriction, but lost flexibility, transparency, and long-term allocative efficiency. Such inversions matter because they do not reverse cleanly when pressure changes. They reshape expectations, institutions, and incentives in ways that persist beyond the original shock. Iran therefore represents not a temporary anomaly, but a living demonstration of long-duration financial exclusion. Understanding this inversion is essential before examining how collapse mechanisms propagate. Without this lens, sanctions appear as episodic events rather than cumulative forces altering system architecture. Time 0.5s. The next layer reveals how these altered incentives interact with debt, trade, and monetary rigidity. From there, patterns of breakdown become visible. They do not emerge suddenly, but through predictable stages shaped by prolonged constraint. Those stages form the backbone of the collapse sequence that follows. Only by mapping this inversion can later consequences be understood without relying on moral judgment or political framing. This framework anchors the analysis ahead, today globally now. The core collapse mechanism in a sanctions-bound economy is not immediate contraction, but progressive misalignment between monetary signals and real economic capacity. In Iran, exclusion from global settlement systems disrupted the normal feedback loops that regulate currency value, credit allocation, and trade pricing. Without reliable access to external financing or reserve buffers, monetary authorities were forced to prioritize short-term liquidity over long-term stability. Money supply expansion became less a policy choice than a survival response, accommodating fiscal pressure, import costs, and social obligations simultaneously. Inflation, therefore, did not spike as a crisis event. It evolved into a continuous condition embedded within daily transactions. Currency depreciation followed a similar logic. Exchange rates ceased to function as discovery mechanisms and instead reflected administrative controls layered over market expectations. Multiple rates emerged, each serving a different constituency, each distorting incentives. Exporters delayed repatriation, importers accelerated purchases, households converted savings into hard assets, and firms shortened planning horizons. These behaviors were individually rational, yet collectively corrosive. Capital allocation drifted towards speculation. Hoarding, time, 0.3s, and rent extraction rather than productivity. Over time, this misallocation compounded, reducing the economy's ability to generate real value even as nominal activity persisted. Trade constraints amplified the effect. Insurance restrictions, shipping access limitations, and payment settlement barriers increased transaction costs invisibly. Goods still moved, but through longer routes, intermediaries, and discounted pricing. Each layer absorbed margin, draining value before it reached domestic producers or consumers. The system adapted by building informal corridors, but these corridors operated without transparency or scale efficiency. What replaced formal trade was not a parallel system of equal strength, but a fragmented network vulnerable to disruption and dependent on constant negotiation. Debt dynamics further entrenched fragility. With limited access to international credit markets, domestic borrowing expanded to compensate. State entities absorbed pressure that would otherwise be externalized, blurring fiscal and monetary boundaries. This blurred boundary reduced policy credibility. Markets no longer interpreted signals as commitments, but as temporary stabilizers. Expectations adjusted downward, reinforcing currency weakness and accelerating price. Pass-through. The feedback loop tightened. Weaker confidence increased inflation. Inflation demanded more liquidity, and liquidity undermined confidence further. Labor markets reflected the same pattern. Wages lagged prices, encouraging multiple income strategies and informal employment. Human capital investment declined as returns became uncertain. Emigration of skilled labor intensified, representing a silent capital outflow, not captured by balance of payments statistics. What remained was an economy increasingly dependent on extractive rents, state mediation, and political alignment rather than innovation or efficiency. This mechanism is not unique, but its duration magnifies impact. Sanctions did not create collapse through a single channel. They synchronized distortions across currency, trade, debt, and labor simultaneously. Each distortion alone was survivable. Together, sustained over decades, they produced structural rigidity. The system did not fail abruptly. It hardened. Adaptation preserved continuity while eroding optionality. And when flexibility disappears, resilience becomes brittle. At that stage, shocks no longer dissipate. They transmit. This is the condition under which historical collapses accelerate. The mechanism is cumulative, not explosive. It is this accumulation that transforms endurance into vulnerability, setting the stage for patterns observed repeatedly across sanctioned and isolated economies in modern history. History offers multiple blueprints for understanding how long-term financial exclusion reshapes economies, and these precedents clarify why endurance often precedes structural failure. In the late 20th century, prolonged isolation produced patterns that closely mirror those visible in Iran today. The experience of Iraq during the 1990s demonstrated how sanctions compress formal output while expanding informal exchange. Official production declined sharply, yet shadow markets proliferated, absorbing labor and redistributing scarce goods through unofficial channels. Inflation stabilized at elevated levels rather than collapsing currency entirely, revealing a system adapting to scarcity by normalizing distortion. What emerged was not economic recovery, but a new equilibrium defined by lower efficiency and higher political control. A similar pattern unfolded in Cuba after the collapse of its primary trading relationships. Though exclusion from global credit and trade did not immediately dismantle state capacity. Instead, rationing systems hardened, dual currency regimes emerged, and productivity losses were masked by administrative stability. Over time, however, investment erosion and capital flight through emigration reduced growth potential. The economy survived, but it did so by consuming its future capacity. These systems illustrate a recurring theme. Sanctions tend to delay visible collapse while accelerating long-term structural degradation. Earlier historical examples reinforce this logic. In the interwar period, Germany experienced constrained access to capital and trade following geopolitical defeat. Currency instability and reparations pressure did not produce immediate breakdown, but they distorted fiscal priorities and encouraged monetary expansion. Informal barter, capital controls, and political radicalization filled gaps left by constrained formal systems. While contexts differ, the mechanism remains consistent. Prolonged restriction alters incentive structure. Time, 0.3s, embedding fragility beneath surface continuity. These precedents matter because they reveal that sanctions function less as decisive instruments and more as slow-acting structural modifiers. In each case, the economy adjusted by reallocating scarcity rather than eliminating it. Households learned to hedge through assets. Firms learned to navigate regulation rather than innovate. And states learned to manage distribution rather than growth. This adaptive behavior reduced volatility but entrenched inefficiency. Over time, the cost was paid through declining productivity, capital depletion, and reduced integration capacity. Applying this blueprint, too, Iran clarifies why collapse has not occurred despite decades of pressure. The Iranian economy exhibits the same characteristics observed historically: segmented exchange rates, capital preservation strategies, expansion of informal trade corridors, and increasing reliance on state mediation. These features do not signal strength, they signal accommodation. Accommodation delays crisis, but accumulates imbalance. As seen in historical cases, the longer this accommodation persists, the more difficult reintegration becomes even if pressure is relaxed. Another critical lesson from history is that prolonged exclusion reshapes political economy internal. Time on 0.5s in sanctioned environments. Groups that control access to scarce channels gain disproportionate influence. Over time, these groups resist normalization because distortion benefits them. This dynamic was evident in Iraq, Cuba, and interwar Germany, and it remains relevant in Iran. Sanctions thus create internal stakeholders invested in continuity of constraint, complicating reform from within. The historical blueprint therefore reframes endurance not as success, but as transition into a different equilibrium. That equilibrium is characterized by lower transparency, higher transaction costs, and reduced adaptive capacity. When external conditions shift, these systems struggle to respond quickly. Shocks that might otherwise be absorbed instead propagate, because buffers have been eroded gradually over time. Understanding this blueprint is essential before examining stage-by-stage breakdown. Without it, endurance appears anomalous. With it, endurance becomes expected, and fragility becomes predictable. History shows that collapse rarely begins at the point of maximum pressure. It begins when accumulated distortions reach a threshold where adaptation no longer compensates. The Iranian case follows this historical logic closely. What remains is to map how these pressures unfold sequentially, revealing the stages through which long-running economic constraints convert resilience into exposure, stage by stage. The breakdown pattern under prolonged economic exclusion follows a sequence that is both gradual and internally consistent. The first stage is normalization of distortion. What begins as temporary controls becomes routine governance. Multiple exchange rates, import prioritization lists, and administrative pricing cease to be emergency tools and instead define everyday economic reality. Households and firms adjust expectations downward. Planning horizons shorten. Stability is redefined not as growth, but as avoidance of sudden disruption. The second stage is institutional hardening. Agencies tasked with managing scarcity expand their influence. Access, not productivity, becomes the primary determinant of success. Firms that can navigate permits, exemptions, and informal channels outperform those that cannot, regardless of efficiency. Over time, this selects for behavior optimized around compliance and negotiation rather than innovation. Institutions become resistant to transparency because opacity preserves discretionary power. The economy continues to function, but information quality deteriorates. The third stage involves capital behavior inversion. Savings shift away from productive investment towards stores of value perceived as safer than domestic. Currency, real assets, foreign currencies, and commodities replace long-term business expansion as preferred vehicles. This behavior is rational at the individual level, but destructive at scale. Productive capacity erodes quietly while nominal activity persists. Capital is preserved, but it is no longer mobilized effectively. The fourth stage is labor fragmentation. Wage systems lag behind inflation, pushing workers into multiple income strategies. Informal employment expands, not as a fringe phenomenon, but as a structural feature. Skilled labor faces diminishing returns domestically and increasing incentives to exit. Emigration accelerates, representing a steady drain of human capital. Unlike financial capital, this loss is rarely reversible. Training systems weaken as the expected payoff declines, further reducing future capacity. The fifth stage centers on fiscal and monetary fusion. With external borrowing constrained, the state absorbs pressure internally. Budget deficits are financed through monetary accommodation, blurring the distinction between fiscal necessity and monetary discipline. Policy credibility erodes because signals are interpreted as reactive rather than strategic. Inflation expectations become entrenched. At this point, time, 0.3s, stabilization efforts require increasingly large interventions to achieve diminishing effects. The sixth stage is trade corridor specialization, formal trade contracts, but it does not disappear. Instead, it reroutes through longer, costlier, and less transparent paths. Each intermediary extracts value, compressing margins for producers and raising prices for consumers. The system adapts by building specialized networks that can operate under constraint. These networks are resilient to pressure, but inefficient by design. They prioritize continuity over optimization. The seventh stage is political economy time, 0.5s. Groups that control access to scarce channels consolidate influence. Their economic survival becomes tied to the persistence of constraint. Reform threatens their position, even if it benefits the broader economy. This creates internal resistance to normalization independent of external pressure. At this stage, policy change becomes increasingly difficult because distortion has beneficiaries as well as victims. The eighth stage involves perception drift. Because collapse has not occurred, endurance is interpreted as success. This perception delays corrective action. Risks are discounted precisely because they have not yet materialized. Meanwhile, buffers continue to erode. Foreign exchange reserves remain thin, infrastructure investment lags, and productivity growth stalls. The system appears stable, but its capacity to absorb shocks diminishes steadily. The ninth stage is fragility crystallization. Flexibility disappears. Small shocks that would previously have been absorbed now transmit across sectors. Currency movements pass through to prices rapidly. Supply disruptions cascade through trade networks. Fiscal adjustments trigger social pressure more quickly because tolerance margins are narrower. At this stage, the system has not collapsed. Time, 0.3s, but it has lost resilience. This sequence matters because it reframes collapse as a process rather than an event. Each stage is survivable. None is catastrophic in isolation. The danger lies in their accumulation. By the time fragility becomes visible, the underlying mechanisms have been in place for years. External observers often mistake endurance for immunity. In reality, endurance under constraint is often the precondition for systemic exposure. The stage-by-stage pattern reveals that prolonged economic pressure does not simply weaken output. It reshapes incentives, institutions, and expectations in ways that compound over time. When the system eventually faces a new shock, whether financial, geopolitical, or social, it responds with rigidity rather than adaptability. That rigidity transforms stress into transmission. Understanding these stages is essential before examining how modern global conditions interact with this structure. Accelerating pressure beyond what gradual adaptation can absorb. Modern global conditions do not replace the pressure mechanisms acting on Iran. They amplify them by reducing the margin between adaptation and exposure. The contemporary financial system is more interconnected, faster, and less tolerant of opacity than earlier historical environments. Payment settlement relies on standardized compliance, shipping insurance concentrates risk, and trade financing is increasingly centralized. These features increase efficiency for integrated economies but magnify friction for those operating at the edge. For Iran, alignment with the modern system does not mean reintegration. It means navigating a landscape where exclusion propagates more rapidly and across more channels simultaneously. One critical alignment is the role of energy markets. Oil remains globally traded, but pricing, transport, and settlement are embedded within financial and regulatory frameworks, dominated by a small number of clearing, insurance, and logistics nodes. When access to these nodes is restricted, trade does not halt, it reroutes. Discounted pricing, longer shipping paths, and opaque intermediaries become standard. This preserves export volumes but compresses revenue and increases volatility. The system appears functional, yet value leakage accelerates. The modern energy market thus converts sanctions into a persistent tax on participation rather than a binary barrier. Another alignment lies in currency hierarchy. The dominance of reserve currencies shapes trade settlement and capital flows. Operating outside this hierarchy imposes conversion costs, limits liquidity, and reduces optionality. Iran's attempts to settle trade through alternative arrangements reflect this constraint. Transactions conducted through bilateral clearing or non-standard instruments reduce dependence on dominant currencies, but introduce frictions that scale poorly. These arrangements work at the margin, not at the core. They provide continuity, not efficiency. In a global system optimized for scale, marginal solutions become progressively disadvantageous. The rise of parallel economic relationships further illustrates alignment pressures. Trade expansion with China and Russia reflects strategic adaptation rather than structural escape. These relationships offer alternative channels for trade, investment, and technology, but they are shaped by asymmetry. Pricing power, financing terms, and risk allocation tend to favor the larger system nodes. Iran gains access, but at a cost embedded within contract structure rather than headline term. Fives over time. Dependency shifts rather than disappears. This mirrors historical patterns where sanctioned economies replace one constraint with another, trading isolation for subordinate integration. Technology intensifies these dynamics. Supply chains now rely on digital compliance, traceability, and monitoring systems. Avoidance strategies become more complex and more fragile. Each workaround introduces points of failure that did not exist in earlier eras. What once required physical interdiction now occurs through administrative exclusion. This increases predictability for enforcers and uncertainty for operators. The cost of maintaining shadow networks rises as monitoring improves, reducing their efficiency advantage. Modern systems therefore compress the space in which informal adaptation can operate sustainably. Financialization also alters alignment. Global markets respond rapidly to signals, expectations, and risk perception. Even when Iran operates outside formal capital markets, sentiment matters. Expectations about currency stability, trade continuity, and political risk influence domestic behavior. Capital flight does not require open borders. It occurs through conversion, hoarding, and emigration. These responses are accelerated by information flows that transmit global narratives instantly. The system becomes sensitive to perception shifts, reducing the lag between signal and response. Another alignment factor is demographic and social pressure. Prolonged economic distortion reshapes expectations across generations. Younger cohorts enter labor markets with lower confidence in domestic opportunity structures. This affects human capital formation, entrepreneurship, and long-term planning. Modern mobility, both physical and digital, lowers the cost of exit. The result is a steady erosion of future capacity that is difficult to reverse. Unlike capita, time 0.3s, human capability lost through emigration does not return easily when conditions change. Regulatory convergence compounds pressure. Global standards for banking, shipping, and trade compliance continue to tighten. Operating outside these standards increases transaction costs and reduces counterpart willingness. Each year of exclusion widens the gap between sanctioned systems and the evolving global baseline. Reintegration, even if politically feasible, becomes technically complex and economically disruptive. Systems built around exception rules struggle to transition back to normal operation without significant dislocation. These alignments demonstrate that modern conditions do not soften long-term sanctions effects. They intensify them by accelerating transmission and narrowing adaptive space. What once unfolded over decades now compresses into shorter cycles of stress response. Iran's endurance within this environment reflects adaptive capacity, but it also signals mounting exposure. The system functions, but with diminishing buffers. Understanding this alignment clarifies why pressure accumulation matters more now than in earlier periods. The next question is not whether adaptation continues, but how quickly accumulated rigidity converts external shocks into internal acceleration. That transition defines the trigger zone ahead. Acceleration occurs when accumulated rigidity meets a shock that the system can no longer absorb elastically. In Iran, this trigger zone is not defined by a single event, but by the convergence of pressures that compress response time. Currency weakness, trade friction, fiscal strain, and social expectations interact in ways that shorten the distance between signal and consequence. What once unfolded gradually begins to propagate rapidly. The first accelerator is expectation shift. After years of managed instability, households and firms internalize inflation and currency erosion as constants. When a new shock arrives, whether through energy, price volatility, intensified enforcement, or geopolitical escalation, behavior adjusts preemptively. Hoarding accelerates, conversion into hard assets intensifies, and planning horizons collapse further. This front-loaded response amplifies impact before policy tools can respond. The system reacts faster than governance mechanisms designed to manage it. The second accelerator is liquidity saturation. Monetary accommodation that once stabilized conditions reaches diminishing returns. Additional liquidity no longer calms markets. It confirms fragility. Price pass-through accelerates because confidence in stabilization erodes. Exchange rate adjustments transmit immediately into consumer prices. Wage negotiation lags widen, compressing real incomes more quickly than in earlier phases. Social tolerance margins narrow, increasing sensitivity to disruption. The third accelerator lies in trade corridor fragility. Shadow networks and informal routes are resilient but brittle. They depend on continuous negotiation, limited enforcement attention, and stable intermediaries. When pressure intensifies, whether through improved monitoring or coordinated restriction, these corridors do not fail incrementally. They stall abruptly. Even temporary disruption can cascade through supply chains optimized for continuity rather than redundancy. Inventory buffers are thin. Substitution options are limited. The result is disproportionate impact relative to the initiating shock. The fourth accelerator is fiscal compression. With external financing constrained and domestic borrowing already elevated, the state's ability to absorb shock weakens. Adjustments that were previously postponed become unavoidable. Subsidy rationalization, tax enforcement, or expenditure cuts transmit quickly into household budgets. Political management of distribution becomes more complex as the resources tighten. The margin for error shrinks. Time descend 0.3s, reducing policy flexibility precisely when it is most needed. The fifth accelerator is social signaling. Information flows amplify perception shifts. Rumors, policy signals, and external narratives circulate rapidly, shaping behavior regardless of formal accuracy. In an environment where trust has been eroded by prolonged distortion, perception often outweighs policy intent. This accelerates feedback loops between expectation and outcome. Stabilization efforts are interpreted defensively rather than strategically, further reducing effectiveness. These accelerators do not create collapse independently. They synchronize time 0.5s. Each shortens the lag between disturbance and response, converting what would once have been manageable stress into cascading pressure. The trigger zone is therefore defined less by magnitude than by timing. When multiple accelerators align, the system transitions from slow adaptation to rapid transmission. This phase is critical because it marks the end of gradualism. Endurance under constraint gives way to exposure under compression. The system still functions, but it does so without buffers. At this point, outcomes are shaped less by policy choice than by structural limits accumulated over time. Understanding this zone clarifies why prolonged stability can precede sudden escalation. What follows is not prediction, but consequence. The final stage examines who bears these costs and how exposure reveals the deeper structure beneath apparent continuity. Consequences emerge not as isolated failures, but as uneven exposure distributed across society and institutions. In prolonged sanction environments, costs do not accumulate symmetrically. Households bear erosion through purchasing power loss and reduced opportunity. Savings decay, consumption narrows, and risk tolerance declines. What appears as resilience is often private adjustment, absorbing systemic strain. Over time, this adjustment exhausts buffers that are invisible in macro indicators. Firms experience exposure through scale limitations. Small and medium enterprises face rising input costs and restricted access, while politically connected or strategically positioned entities consolidate share. Market concentration increases, not through competition, but through survival filtering. This reduces dynamism and reinforces dependence on state mediation. Innovation slows because uncertainty shortens investment horizons. Productivity losses compound quietly. The state absorbs exposure through fiscal and monetary strain. Administrative control expands to manage scarcity, increasing governance complexity and enforcement cost. Policy effectiveness declines as tools are used defensively rather than strategically. Credibility erodes because commitments are perceived as conditional. Each intervention stabilizes, temporarily, while increasing future rigidity. Social exposure manifests through expectation, realignment. Younger cohorts recalibrate aspirations downward or outward. Human capital formation weakens as returns become uncertain. Emigration intensifies not as protest, but as optimization. This represents a permanent transfer of future capacity, invisible in short-term accounts. Externally, Exposure reveals itself through integration limits. Trade continues, but at widening discounts. Dependency shifts rather than resolves. Reintegration, even if permitted, becomes technically disruptive and socially costly. The longer the system operates under exception, the more expensive normalization becomes. These consequences do not signify imminent collapse. They signify cumulative exposure. Endurance masks cost distribution until adjustment capacity is exhausted. At that point, pressure reveals structure rather than causing it. What remains is to understand how such systems are judged historically, not by timing, but by sequence. History rarely records collapse at the moment pressure is applied. It records it when adaptation reaches its limit. Iran's economic trajectory under prolonged sanctions illustrates this distinction clearly. Endurance delayed visible failure while embedding structural distortion, misallocation, and rigidity beneath surface continuity. The system did not break because it was weak. It became exposed because it survived too long under exception. What matters is not whether pressure persists, but how long incentives, institutions, and expectations are reshaped by it. In such systems, sequence determines outcome. Timing only determines when recognition arrives. History judges systems by structure, not intention or resilience.